What's up, everybody? Welcome to the video. It's Ryan here on the Max Afterburner channel. Former F-15E combat fighter pilot, F-16 Thunderbird pilot, airline pilot flying the Boeing 737 and the Airbus A220. Quick correction before we dive in. I dug into this story and the actual reporting doesn't match a 30,000-pound bunker buster on a missile factory claim. What actually happened, confirmed by CENTCOM, is that B-2 Spirit stealth bombers struck hardened Iranian ballistic missile facilities using GBU-31 2,000-pound bombs, not the GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrator. That's still a genuinely significant story, just a different weapon than the title suggests. So let's break down what actually happened. I'll walk through the actual confirmed strike on Iran's missile facilities, then explain why the GBU-57 has been reserved for nuclear sites and leadership targets specifically rather than used here, then the broader context this strike landed in, and finish with my take on why this particular mission matters even without the 30,000-pound weapon. On March 1st, 2026, CENTCOM confirmed B-2 Spirit stealth bombers flying from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri executed strikes against hardened Iranian ballistic missile facilities. The operation, part of what's been called Operation Epic Fury, involved 4 B-2s dropping GBU-31 2,000-pound bombs on targets described as hardened underground Iranian missile infrastructure. Analysts monitoring open-source flight data tracked the bombers making the transit from the US toward Iran, the same kind of open-source tracking I've referenced in several other videos on this war's bomber deployments. This landed at a genuinely brutal moment in the war's timeline. It came right after Israel had already launched another round of strikes following the joint US-Israeli operation that killed Iran's supreme leader Khamenei on the preceding Saturday. CENTCOM also confirmed that same weekend that 3 US service members were killed and 5 seriously injured, the military's first casualties since the war began. Trump, in an interview with The Atlantic published that Sunday, said he'd agreed to speak with Iran's new leadership while simultaneously pushing for regime change and warning Tehran not to retaliate. I want to explain the actual weapons distinction because it tells you something real about how target categories get matched to munitions in this war. The GBU-31, fitted with a BLU-109 penetrating warhead, is a capable bunker buster in its own right, but it's a fundamentally smaller weapon than the GBU-57, roughly 2,000 pounds, against 30,000, with correspondingly less penetration depth. The GBU-57 has been reserved throughout this war specifically for the hardest, deepest targets, Fordo and Natanz during Operation Midnight Hammer, and reportedly an IRGC leadership bunker during a separate operation I covered in an earlier video. Using GBU-31s against missile facilities instead suggests those specific targets, while genuinely hardened, weren't assessed as requiring the full-size MOP to defeat, a meaningful distinction given how scarce and slow to replenish the GBU-57 stockpile actually is, something I've covered in detail across multiple videos on this channel. I want to place this strike more fully into the timeline of how this war actually opened, because the weekend it happened in is arguably the single most consequential 72-hour stretch of the entire conflict. The initial joint US-Israeli strikes hit Iran on Saturday, February 28th, killing Khamenei himself along with several senior officials. Israel followed with continued strikes into Sunday. The B-2 mission against missile facilities landed right in the middle of that opening window, meaning American stealth bombers were flying combat missions into Iranian airspace within the first 48 to 72 hours of a war that had just claimed the life of the country's supreme leader. That's an extraordinarily compressed, extraordinarily intense opening phase, and it tells you the B-2 fleet wasn't held in reserve for some later, more deliberate phase of the campaign. It was committed essentially immediately, alongside the confirmed American casualties, 3 killed and 5 wounded, that same weekend. That timing also matters for understanding target selection. Striking hardened ballistic missile facilities in those opening days, rather than waiting to assess Iran's response to the initial leadership strikes first, suggests American and Allied planners had already identified degrading Iran's missile capability as an immediate, day-one priority, not something to be addressed only after Iran's actual retaliatory posture became clear. Given everything I've covered throughout this series about how central Iran's missile and drone arsenal has been to nearly every subsequent phase of this war, the strikes on Jordan and Kuwait, the exchanges I've documented across multiple videos, that early prioritization looks, in hindsight, like a genuinely accurate read of where the war's center of gravity was actually going to sit for months afterward. I want to clarify something about the operation name itself, because I've referenced Epic Fury in a different context in an earlier video on this channel, covering the daring rescue of a downed F-15E crew member. That earlier coverage and this missile facility strike both appear to fall under the same overarching operation name, which tells you Epic Fury wasn't a single mission. It was a broader, sustained campaign name covering multiple distinct operations across different phases of this war, strikes, rescues, and follow-on missions, all conducted under one umbrella operational designation. That's fairly standard practice in how the US military names and organizes sustained campaigns, but it's worth clarifying for anyone trying to piece together the full timeline for my various videos, because seeing the same operation name attached to a missile facility strike and a personnel rescue mission can otherwise look confusing without that context. I want to spend a little more time on why I corrected the title's claim rather than just running with it, because I think it's worth explaining the actual stakes involved in getting these details right, beyond just general accuracy. Throughout this entire series, I've tracked how scarce and strategically significant the GBU-57 specifically is, a stockpile that's been meaningfully depleted after its confirmed uses, with replenishment not expected until 2028. If viewers walked away from a video believing the GBU-57 had been used a third or fourth time against missile facilities specifically, that would meaningfully distort the actual picture of how thin that particular capability has become, and how carefully it's being rationed for the hardest targets specifically. Getting the weapon class right also matters for understanding Iran's own likely assessment of what it's actually facing. If Iranian military planners believed the US was liberally using its scarcest, most powerful bunker buster against a broader category of targets like missile facilities, rather than reserving it specifically for nuclear sites and leadership targets, that would change their own calculus about how much of that specific threat they need to plan around when hardening various categories of infrastructure. Precision in reporting which weapon actually gets used against which target isn't just a pedantic detail, it's the kind of information that shapes how seriously to take future threats, how to interpret escalation patterns, and how to understand the actual constraints and priorities driving American targeting decisions throughout this entire war. I also want to give the GBU-31 itself a little more attention, since it's actually shown up in my coverage before without me fully explaining it as its own weapon system. It's part of the broader Joint Direct Attack munition family, essentially a 2,000-pound class bomb, either a Mark 84 general purpose bomb, or, in its penetrating BLU-109 variant, used specifically against hardened targets like the missile facilities in this strike, fitted with GPS and inertial guidance for precision delivery. It's a far more numerous, far more readily available weapon than the GBU-57, produced at meaningfully larger scale and carried by a much wider range of aircraft beyond just the B-2. That's exactly why its use here, rather than the GBU-57, makes strategic sense once you understand the actual weapons economics I've covered throughout this series. If a target can be adequately defeated with a 2,000-pound penetrator, using that weapon instead of committing one of the extremely scarce 30,000-pound MOPs preserves the more powerful weapon, specifically for targets that genuinely require that level of penetration, exactly the kind of resource discipline I've documented as a consistent theme across this entire war, from the B-1 and GBU-72 rollout I covered in another video, to the careful, repeated restraint shown around Karg Island's oil infrastructure in yet another. This missile facility strike fits that same broader pattern of matching weapon scarcity and power to target hardness as precisely as possible, rather than defaulting to maximum force against every hardened target, regardless of whether it's actually necessary. I've covered in other videos just how demanding a single B-2 mission from White Man Air Force Base actually is, and this specific strike is a good illustration of exactly that logistics challenge. 4 B-2s making the transit from Missouri to Iranian airspace and back represents a multi-thousand-mile round trip requiring extensive aerial refueling support, careful route planning to avoid unnecessarily exposing the aircraft over contested or unfriendly airspace along the way, and enough advanced intelligence and mission planning to identify and confirm the specific hardened missile facilities being targeted before the aircraft ever left the ground. Open source flight trackers being able to follow this specific movement, as multiple outlets reported, tells you something about how visible these missions have become despite the aircraft's stealth characteristics once airborne. Ironically, the takeoff and transit portions of a B-2 mission are often trackable through conventional means even when the aircraft itself becomes effectively invisible to radar, once it's actually operating in contested airspace near the target. That visibility during transit is worth remembering given how much I've emphasized stealth and secrecy throughout my coverage of this war's bomber operations. The B-2's stealth characteristics matter most specifically during the target engagement phase, when radar cross-section reduction actually determines whether the aircraft can safely penetrate defended airspace and deliver its weapons without being detected and engaged. The takeoff from a well-known American airbase and the long transit across friendly or neutral airspace beforehand doesn't require or particularly benefit from the same stealth profile, which is exactly why open source analysts have been able to track B-2 movements toward this theater repeatedly throughout this war, even while the actual moment of weapons release inside Iranian airspace remains far harder to observe or confirm in real time. I mentioned the 3 American service members killed and 5 wounded that same weekend, and I want to give that its own proper weight, rather than just noting it in passing. This represented the war's first American casualties, a genuinely significant threshold crossing in any conflict. The moment a war stops being purely about strikes against an adversary and starts extracting a direct human cost from your own side. Coming in the same 72-hour window as the B-2 missile facility strikes, Khamenei's killing, and the broader opening salvo of this war, it's a reminder of just how violent and consequential that initial opening weekend actually was, compared to the more incremental, extended campaign that's characterized much of this war's later months, the kind of 13 consecutive nights strike patterns and gradual escalation cycles I've documented extensively in my more recent videos on this conflict. I think that contrast is worth sitting with. This war opened with an extraordinarily intense, compressed burst of violence, leadership decapitation strikes, American casualties, B-2 missions against missile facilities, all within roughly 72 hours, before settling into the longer, more grinding pattern of strikes, pauses, and renewed escalation that's defined most of what I've covered across this entire series since. Understanding that the war's actual character shifted meaningfully between that violent opening weekend and the more prolonged campaign that followed helps make sense of why individual strikes later in the war, however significant on their own, rarely carry quite the same singular history-making weight as those first 72 hours did. I also want to spend more time on Trump's Atlantic interview comments from that same weekend, because I don't think a single sentence fully captures how significant that specific combination of statements actually was. Saying he'd agreed to speak with Iran's new leadership while simultaneously pushing for regime change and warning Tehran not to retaliate represents three distinct, somewhat contradictory messages delivered in the same conversation: openness to diplomacy, an explicit stated preference for the current government's removal, and a direct deterrent warning all at once. That's a genuinely complicated position for a foreign government to interpret and respond to, and I think it actually explains a lot about the erratic, inconsistent pattern of Iranian behavior I've documented throughout this entire series, alternating between diplomatic engagement and continued military retaliation, sometimes within the same 48-hour window, exactly the kind of pattern I flagged in my video on the Hormuz negotiations and the dueling compensation demands. If Iran's own leadership, even in its earliest, most chaotic days following Khamenei's killing, was already receiving genuinely mixed signals from the American side, willingness to talk paired with an explicit regime change goal, that helps explain why building durable trust between these two governments has proven so difficult throughout the rest of this war. A government told simultaneously that its removal is a stated American objective, and that diplomatic engagement remains available has very little incentive to fully commit to that diplomatic track, since any agreement reached could plausibly be viewed by the other side as merely a tactical pause on the way to the stated, more fundamental goal of removing that government entirely. That tension, I think, has quietly shaped nearly every diplomatic development I've covered across this entire series, even when it doesn't get explicitly named in each individual news cycle. I think this is a good example of why it's worth checking the actual sourcing behind a dramatic title before running with it. The real story here, B-2s hitting hardened missile facilities with a smaller, more available penetrator during one of the war's most brutal opening weekends, is genuinely significant on its own merits. It shows the B-2 fleet being used flexibly across different weapon classes, depending on target hardness, not just as a one-trick platform for the GBU-57. But claiming a 30,000-pound weapon was used here when the actual confirmed munition was a 2,000-pound GBU-31 would be spreading inaccurate information about an active war, and I'd rather get it right. I also think this specific strike, properly understood with the correct weapon details, tells a more interesting story than the inflated version would have anyway. A war that opens with this much simultaneous intensity, decapitation strikes, American casualties, B-2 missions calibrated precisely to match weapon scarcity against target hardness, tells you the planning and targeting discipline behind this campaign was remarkably sophisticated from day one, not just in its most famous headline-grabbing moments like Operation Midnight Hammer, but in these earlier, less publicized strikes too. That consistency of approach, matching munitions carefully to target requirements rather than defaulting to maximum force everywhere, is exactly the kind of resource discipline that's allowed this war's most scarce capabilities, the GBU-57 chief among them, to remain available for the specific, hardest targets that have continued emerging throughout this conflict's later months. So that's the accurate version of this story. B-2s striking Iranian ballistic missile facilities with GBU-31 bombs during Operation Epic Fury, landing in the same brutal weekend as Khamenei's killing and the war's first American casualties, all while Trump was simultaneously signaling openness to talks and an explicit regime change goal in the same breath. The 30,000-pound GBU-57 remains reserved for the hardest nuclear and leadership targets specifically, which I've covered in detail elsewhere. And understanding that distinction actually makes this entire episode a clearer window into how carefully this campaign's targeting decisions have been made from the very first weekend of the war onward. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and hit subscribe for the next update. This is Ryan, also known as Max Afterburner, also known as the fighter pilot next door, signing off.